host, and we're going to be covering best practices for leading impactful meetings. So my name is Kelly. I am a project manager and consultant with Echo Consulting. We are a consulting organization that provides short-term, part-time project management services. We do process improvement and software implementations. We'll do training and strategic annual planning. So we do a whole sorts of stuff, and just wanted to get with you today to cover some of our best practices while leading meetings. Just some rules of engagement before we dig in. So feel free to unmute yourself at any point in the presentation. We love questions, so you're welcome to unmute and just ask as we go along. You can also use the chat box. Molly's here on the call as well, and she'll be monitoring the chat box for any questions that are coming in. You can feel free to take notes, but just be aware that we will be sending out this slide deck after the webinar. So don't worry, you'll get this content that you can reference later as well. We'll also be sending out a survey for feedback after this webinar. So we appreciate any feedback that you have for the content on this call today, or as well as any feedback on future presentations that you might like to see.
Hi, quick question. Are we supposed to, I'm not seeing this any screen yet. It just says waiting for others to join. Can I try rejoining?
How about everybody else on the call? Can anybody else see my screen?
I'm seeing your screen all right, Kelly.
Okay, yeah, Jed, maybe you should just jump back in. Yeah, let us know. Thanks for calling that out. Okay. Perfect. So what to expect, these are the main 3 tenets that we're going to cover today within this topic. So preparation for meetings, best practices in running and leading impactful meetings, as well as follow-up. And really my goal for today is for you to really be able to take away a few nuggets or potentially even create your own checklist from this presentation, right? Again, we'll be sending out the deck, so you'll kind of have the list of items, but we framed it in a way where you can really use it as a checklist of things that you want to make sure that are covered in your preparation during the meeting and in your follow-up to make sure that you lead successful meetings. So we'll start with preparation. So before you even schedule a meeting, right, we really want to define the purpose and make sure that we have a clear objective to make sure, ensure that you're going to have a productive meeting. So really start to think about, what am I trying to accomplish in this meeting? What is the end goal that we're trying to get to? Does it need to be a meeting, right? I'm sure everybody on this call has been to meetings in the past where you said, probably maybe could have been an email. Everybody's very busy, these days. And so it's really important to make sure that when you are scheduling a meeting that you're really clear on what your objective and your goals are to make it as successful as possible and impactful for both you and the participants that are attending. So before you schedule that meeting, you want to cover your agenda, right? So make sure you understand the time and location of your meeting. In the age that we're in right now, are you meeting in person? Do you need to make sure you have a specific conference room booked? Are you managing several different schedules? Are you just using a virtual meeting? So all kind of components to keep in mind when you're putting together that agenda. Again, with what we just discussed in your purpose, making sure that you're including your meeting objective in your agenda for your meeting when you're going to send out that invitation that you would send out and include those list of topics. You're going to have that list of topics, and this is kind of a pre-work item that you want to make sure that you're sending or you're able to send out in your meeting invitation. So what are the specific areas that you need to make sure are covered to ensure that you are meeting that goal or objective that you have, or that outcome that you'd like to accomplish? Time frame for each item. So I'd say this item is optional, but it's just something to keep in mind. If it's a very heavy meeting with a lot of participants, it can be really happy to have a time frame for each specific item. Okay, we're only going to spend 5 minutes here. We're going to spend 10 minutes here. And that's just a way to kind of keep the whole group wrangled and understand expectations from the get-go. Again, especially with those meetings that have a lot of attendees, as it can those meetings can tend to go in a lot of different directions. So having that really container for your attendees to kind of stick to can help provide that structure. If it's a smaller meeting and maybe you don't have specific timeframes, it can still be helpful just to understand what are the areas that we're going to spend the bulk of our time on, and really setting that expectation, whether in the agenda meeting or at the welcome of your meeting, which we'll get to as well.
Kelly, we have a couple of great questions coming in from Alex. So he mentions, is it best practice to include the agenda in the calendar invite itself or to attach as a file? And then he also mentioned the possibility of whether or not we should be sending an email to kind of prep stakeholders before the actual invite goes out from a calendar invite. So great questions, Alex. Thanks for sharing with everyone.
Those are great questions. Yeah. So the first question, I would say my recommendation is absolutely to include the agenda in the meeting invite itself. That's where it's going to be the easiest for folks to reference back to and make sure they understand what the meeting is about. Sorry, Molly, you said 3 questions. Can you repeat the second one? I just want to make sure I hit.
No, absolutely. So is it best practice to include the agenda in the calendar invite or as attached as a file? And you said in the calendar invite always. The attached file really comes in if you have participants that have multiple different calendar systems. So if you have Outlook and Google or you might have international participants or something along those lines, the attachment can be in addition to, but it must always be in the calendar invite itself. The secondary question, Kelly, was should we send an email and an invite, or is it usually one or the other?
Yep. Okay. That's a great question. And I think that last one is really dependent. So I think in a lot of cases, you can just include the agenda in the meeting invite and any expectations for that meeting. If you need to expand on that, or maybe you have participants in the meeting that you're really expecting to bring something to the table, maybe they're responsible for providing a presentation, maybe they're responsible for reviewing a new process, things like that, I would recommend doing a separate email, and it's almost like a prep plan with those participants. And depending on the depth of that, you can choose to either do that over email, or even sometimes I'll do a quick pre-planning meeting. It depends on how complex that is. Again, in the light of respecting people's time and calendar, sometimes you can even just tack on a 15 minutes or 5 minutes right before the meeting, making sure all the stakeholders that are have one of those active kind of lead roles is prepared. So that would be my recommendation there.
And just to tack on to what Kelly is saying, I literally had that example with a client today. So we are going to be reviewing a process flow diagram. So in addition to including that in my agenda as a prerequisite and attaching the document itself or the link to the document repository in the invite, I also am having a follow-up with that person because it's a new stakeholder that I haven't met one-on-one with, to make sure that they have access to everything that they need ahead of the meeting. So having that prerequisite terminology associated with this is what we need in order to make this meeting effective. So great questions, Alex. Thank you so much. All right, Kelly.
Great. Perfect. And then the last point I didn't make on this slide is just something that can also be helpful is next to each agenda item, including the type of action that's needed. Is it a discussion? Are we making a decision? Is there going to be follow-up action? Is there going to be a presentation? So you can always just in that list of topics include a little bit more information about what the participants and attendees can potentially expect. So selecting the right participants, this is a really, really important one, right? So we want to make sure that we have the right people in the meeting to be able to get to our expected outcome, right? When we think about that purpose, who are the people that we need to be able to meet that purpose and that agenda? So decision makers, 100%, we need to make sure that we have the right decision makers on the call so that we don't get stalled or blocked on being able to move forward on something. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we have folks, we like to call them SMEs, so subject matter experts for required insight. So think of a team member that maybe has a perspective or insight or expertise in an area that only they can really represent, to make sure that they can bring that information to the table to feed into, again, whatever that objective or outcome is, and also making sure that you're providing all of the appropriate information if there is a decision to be made to those decision makers. If you're ever unsure, when there's people that you think would be helpful, but they're not required. Don't forget about the option to include them as optional attendees. So in the light of respecting people's schedules, you can always throw people on as optional, especially if their awareness, maybe they don't have a required insight or they're not a decision maker. But if it's just they need to be aware or it's helpful for them to be aware, you can throw them on as optional, and that way they can join if they'd like. And really our big gotcha here, right, is the more people who attend a meeting, the bigger drop in productivity. So when I go back to that kind of time boxing discussion that I mentioned when you're prepping the agenda, as I mentioned, when you have more people, right, there's more voices, so it can just cause meetings to go in different directions at times, which can be great in some examples and being able to bring in those perspectives. But it can cause a drop in productivity and just cause longer discussion. So that's really where you want to try to have the most structure, is when you have a larger audience in your meetings. Awesome. After the agenda has been sent out, you can also solicit feedback, questions, any survey input. So what we mean by this is, to Alex's question too, you can do this a couple of different ways. So you can include in your meeting agenda invite, you can just actually ask the team members if you have any feedback on this agenda or items that you'd like to add to the agenda. Don't hesitate to let me know. If there are, if you're co-leading the meeting, so as we mentioned with, stakeholders who are going to be coming to the table with a presentation or a specific deliverable, you can specifically solicit their feedback as well. Hey, did I include everything we needed to? Do you have any areas that you think I should fill in to make sure we're set up for success?
So not to go too far back, Kelly, but I have to ask this question. So when we say that as you invite more participants, right, the productivity goes down, what is that target threshold in terms of meeting design, in terms of the number of participants that you really like to target? How do you know when you need to break that out? Are there meeting types or things like that that kind of help determine what your target number of participants are?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, right. So I mentioned this before, and there's definitely several different types of meetings, right? Sometimes meetings are just to have a discussion. And in discussion type meetings, it may be helpful to have a little bit more perspective and have that broader audience to be able to have different sides of the business, providing insight and understanding all the different angles. When you have a decision type making meeting, like at the end of this meeting, we need to have a specific decision on X item, that can be a lot more helpful to have less team members and really only have the people that are required. Because again, that's where you get into, you open it up, you have way more opinions, but at the end of the day, you really need a decision to be made by specific people. You also have, training type meetings, right? Like, so training is another opportunity. And typically we like to target between or like under 8 individuals, depending on the training type, right? And also depending on your organization size. I know for large organizations, you are likely going to have organization-wide trainings at times, but really the under 8 people is going to allow us or allow you to be more successful in making sure that those participants are staying engaged, able to ask specific questions, and guided along. And I'd say that number of 8 is also a good, just general number for meetings before they start to get a little bit too widespread.
And I think you talked about this really well early on as well, which is like when you're talking about a meeting, when you're thinking about, are you informing people? Is it an informational meeting where it is one directional in terms of there are specific speakers that are providing information? Or is it a meeting where you are gathering input? Or is it a situation where your participants are moving back and forth? And then as a project manager, as a meeting leader, knowing who your stakeholders are in that meeting and what comfort level they have in raising their hand up to participate, depending on the size as well. So a lot of great things, but that I think that your point about preparation for meeting and meeting design to really be the most effective is so critical to making a meeting impactful. So thank you, Kelly.
Absolutely. Great questions. Okay, so some best practices for actually leading your meeting. Creating a welcoming environment, of course, so everybody jumps on the call, making sure everybody is comfortable with potentially how to use the technology. I lean towards that because I know so many of us are in the virtual meeting space right now. Does everyone understand the technology that we're on, understand how to mute, unmute? Do they know the rules of engagement? Obviously, depending on the meeting size, sometimes there's small talk in terms of creating that welcome environment. And then same thing, I guess, even if you are in person, making sure everybody is able to connect to the internet, or, you know, that the leaders of the meeting or anyone that's presenting, if it's not you, is able to connect to the right equipment and all that good jazz. Also starting with the end in mind. So we kind of talked about this already, right, in the preparation of the meeting. When you're opening the meeting, making sure that you're opening in that way. So first of all, providing an introduction, why are we here today? And then moving into what is the goal of this meeting? Is it a discussion? Is it a decision meeting? Is it a training meeting? And also specifically stating by the end of this meeting, it's our goal to blank, right? By the end of this meeting, it is our goal to make a decision on X item. By the end of this meeting, we'd like to have a discussion and understand what our next steps are, or if we need to pull in additional resources to move forward this specific initiative, etc. So reviewing that purpose, I kind of just talked about that with starting with the end in mind. Re-reviewing the agenda. You can also at the beginning of the meeting, when you review the agenda, understand if anybody has any additional items. I usually like to ask, you know, does anyone have any items to add to our list today? If not, we will make sure that we reserve, you know, 10, 15, 5, whatever it is, minutes at the end for any questions or other items that you thought of throughout the time.
Kelly, you've got a couple of great questions coming in. I just want to take a pause here. So Brian asked for formal meetings, right? So this is the information, annual board meeting, vendor solicitation meetings, things like that. Do you always recommend preparation of an agenda? And then we also have another one coming in from Vincent about how long do you wait to get the meeting started? And what do you do when the participants are showing up late and really ruin the flow of that? So.
Yep, absolutely. So for formal meetings, 100%, I always recommend framing up an agenda for something that's specifically like a full day, right? We want to make sure that the stakeholders understand where their time is going to be spent, if they're responsible for bringing anything, if they're responsible for leading any sections, are there any guests joining the meetings? Also making sure they understand when their break times are they going to have time to check email throughout the day? Do they need to log out, you know, shut down their computer, not be able to be available to others? All those sorts of specific detailed pieces, I think, are really important to include. Before I move on from that one, Molly, do you have anything else to add to that one?
Oh, we always have an agenda. The way I think about it is the level of detail of the agenda can really be adjusted to meet the needs. So in cases where you're providing all brand new information and you don't really want to put a lot of that information out there ahead of time, especially if it could cause issues if they can't immediately ask questions, sometimes it might be higher level, but always saying what that objective is and what those different components of the meeting ahead of time. And leadership especially needs to lead by example in those cases in order for adoption for the rest of the team. So
Absolutely.
yes.
And then to answer your question, Vincent, I think this also just really depends on a couple of factors. So A, the meeting size, and B, the stakeholders that are missing from the meeting. So I have been in meetings before where like the primary stakeholders missing, they're responsible for, they're the subject matter expert. And so starting the meeting would be, without them would be less impactful. So I might hang on a little bit longer for that individual. If you're on a large meeting and you've done the pre-prep and the stakeholders that are supposed to be there to present are, you know, you talk to them 5 minutes before, like we talked about in that pre-planning, and everybody's ready to go, we probably want to wait less time on a larger meeting to get going on that, right? So for example, on these types of webinars, we usually only wait until a minute or two pass because we've put it on people's calendars, they've taken time out of their day to come, and it might be you know, more people coming, or we don't always know exactly how many, so we want to be respectful of everybody's time.
And let's be honest, I skip the first 3 minutes of webinars because it's always admin anyways. But Vincent brings up a great question, Kelly, that I think you were going to get to, but I want to bring up here as well, which is when do you make the call to cancel that meeting if you don't have a critical stakeholder? That's
Yeah.
always a hard one for me.
It is really hard. I would say 10 minutes is usually what I go with personally. I think 5 minutes is a little bit of, they could be running from another meeting. So it's somewhere between that 5, maybe it's more like 7 minutes, but it's somewhere between that 5 and 10 minute mark. Of course, we're reaching out to that person, especially if they were supposed to be a primary stakeholder on the call, to understand if they're coming, if they're running late, just so that we can at least inform the participants while they're hanging on.
And I am happy to have audience participation here. You guys are asking some great questions. I oftentimes feel that is a question that really relates to the culture of the organization and the expectations set, right?
Mhm.
So there are organizations that are really fantastic and mature in the way that they start meetings 5 minutes after the hour. They anticipate and like they have really strict guidelines in terms of what that looks like. In other organizations, as a consulting organization with clients and everything, sometimes I give a little bit more time depending on the organization and the expectation, depending on if I have access to send an instant message or what the expectation is set there. But I oftentimes feel like from organization to organization, there are different rules of engagement associated with meeting start times. We've definitely been brought in to help some organizations have better experiences with not wasting time in the beginning of meetings and making sure that the meetings come out with action items. But it's a great question, and there's not a one size fit all answer to it.
Yep. Great points, Molly. Thank you. Okay. So we're for opening meetings, assigning roles. So this really depends on the meeting size also. So in some cases, as the meeting leader, you may be the note taker and the timekeeper. And making sure that you're seeing who's attending, right? But for a larger meeting, or maybe even a meeting that you're presenting on, so for example, this webinar, right? I am presenting, I have the presentation up on my screen, so Molly is keeping, she has been assigned the role of keeping track of questions in the chat and taking any notes if we need to, and that type of thing. So you don't always need to assign specific roles. Sometimes you are going to be that assigner if you are the leader of the meeting, but in those larger scale meetings, or depending on the circumstances, you're going to assign out roles, right? Also setting expectations. So, if it's virtual, is the expectation that cameras are on? If you're in person, is the expectation that, laptops are closed? And again, kind of going back to starting with the end in mind, setting expectations on, what is our end result going to be? Is this a discussion or is this a decision?
So in that vein, actually, with the cameras on, what are the thoughts on meetings these days, virtual meetings especially? How effective is a meeting where you have cameras on versus not cameras?
That's a great question. So I think our perspective, and Molly, jump in, is that for virtual meetings, always cameras on, right? I remember when I had to first leave work and start to work from home, and it being like, oh, we have to be on camera every single time. And now when we're not on camera, it feels strange, right? It just allows you to connect with people. It allows you to see the reactions as if you were in person. It makes sure that those folks that are joining are paying attention. They're engaged and paying attention.
So hold up though. We just talked about meeting types, everyone. So while I absolutely love seeing all of your smiling faces and you are amazing, this would be an informational type meeting as much as I'm trying to make it participatory. So again, like that culture and understanding if people are asking questions. Vincent just turned on his video when he went to ask a question. That was an important piece there. But if you've got a large audience and or you're primarily listening in, you're not actually participating, it's more acceptable in my experience to not have videos because that can be distracting for some users. But again, really comes back to cultural shift and components. When that meeting is occurring, right, matters as well. And there's some other components to that. So never a one size fits all, but great questions, and definitely something that as a meeting leader is part of your planning and your meeting design to make sure that you're getting the most impact out of your meetings. Did someone have a quick follow-up? Alex said, my practice has been that this is an equity issue, so I tend to let folks decide for themselves while encouraging them to be on. I think that's a great call out as well. Some people have different levels of access during the day, depending on the flexibility, if they're on the move or something like that. It is preferable to have everyone following the same rules or expectations rather than some people on and off. So great point, Alex.
I'd also add, Molly, just in my experience with virtual meetings, that I think it's kind of I guess a culture thing. I find that if you have everybody on with cameras, even if it's a small audience, like sometimes a team of like 3 to 5, that you get a lot of, and I also notice it's more of a male thing than a female thing. You get a lot of like cross talking and a lot of talking over. And that may not be what you want. So that's another thing, kind of back to Kelly's point, I think about, planning an agenda is like, one TTP technique procedure I use with meetings that I hold in my nonprofit is, unless if you're a board member or you are SME or whatever you want to call it, like a keynote speaker, you're off camera. Because
It can be
I
distracting.
just
Yeah.
well, yeah, and I think human nature is, if you see people, right, you're going to talk to them in meetings, because sometimes you get a lot of cross chatter or sidebars even going on. So I just like, hey, unless you have a speaking role defined in the agenda, and or you're coming on to say something, I usually ask to stay muted, stay off camera. I just find that maybe it's the people I deal with, and the personality types in specific, but I find that generally seems to work better when we kind of like, then somebody's in listening mode versus like, they're getting ready to say something, and it kind of eliminates a lot of cross conversation that's not needed.
Yep. No, it's great. And again, setting those expectations early and clearly communicating them is a critical component. Kelly, we're talking about meeting best practices and we're down to our last 2 minutes. We're not going to finish on time. What should we do in this scenario? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, so obviously we want to be respectful of everyone's time and provide flexibility. So as you mentioned, we're going to continue to record this call. And so I can continue to work through the slides and get through the best that I can in the next 2 minutes. But we can continue to record after that so folks can finish up in their own time. And now seeing how much engagement and excitement we have around this topic, knowing that we'll definitely want to schedule another webinar on this in the future and expand our time so that we have more time for this back and forth communication, which is awesome, as well as getting through our content. Awesome. So around engagement, on that point of everybody engaging so well on this call, that's not always the case, right? So how do we make sure that team members are equally engaging across the team, or that everybody's voice is really being heard? So one thing, asking members directly for their input. So I know this can feel a little bit like putting people on the spot, but it can be helpful to, just make sure that you're framing it in a way that makes them feel valued and understood why we're asking their feedback. So Molly, I think it's really important to, hear from your perspective how this impacts your team. We want to make sure that we're, building plans into our project to accommodate your team members directly. Do you have any specific feedback for us to make sure that we incorporate that into the future? So making sure that you're framing it in a way that's going to be for their value and their gain versus just, hey, what do you think about this, Molly? And kind of just putting them on the spot in that way, but just making sure that you're including them, because some team members may feel uncomfortable in speaking up if you don't directly ask them for their input in a way that makes them feel welcome. Kicking off with brainstorming activities that can really just make people feel comfortable and get them in the mode for engaging. So in person, this might look like whiteboarding or doing Post-it notes up on a wall, right? Doing a writing activity and then asking everybody to share virtually, right? Microsoft Teams has whiteboarding capabilities as well. So there's a few different ways that you can do that. There are other tools that we use called Mural to kind of facilitate some of those brainstorming activities. You can also do actual surveys on your calls and have them set to anonymous, so you can get that feedback, and then that can also spark conversation where people can see other folks' feedback, even if it is anonymous, to kind of get people's minds turning and get them excited about the topic. Making sure that you're catering to different learning styles. right? So not just speaking, but making sure that you're showing, using examples, especially if you have, team members of different audiences or different departments, making sure that you're putting it into terms that they understand, or putting out examples that are going to feel real to them, and always having some type of visual that people can cue off of in addition to speaking through. Time management. So as we mentioned before, depending on the size of the meeting, it can be helpful to add a time allotment to your specific topics in your agenda. Also, as you're going through your items, making sure that you're asking for input on the specific item that you're on to really move that through to resolution. So being mindful of, you have this topic on your agenda so that you can get to your end or get to your objective in mind. So making sure that you're asking for resolution on the call, or getting the answer that you need. Or if you're not, keeping momentum by making sure that you have a specific action item to put it in a parking lot, we like to say, on a backlog, if you have a specific list that you keep, or potentially following up, right? If it's a recurring meeting cadence, maybe it's okay, we're bumping this to the next meeting so we don't lose sight of it. I also like to say in time management, providing structure and flexibility. So in addition to having the structured agenda and potentially having time allotments, making sure that we also allow for some flexibility, right? So making sure that you have time built in at the end to allow for questions and some flexible conversation. So staying on track, this is meeting scope creep. This can happen a lot, right? With those wider meetings, like I talked about, when we get into the 10, 15 people on a call, and it is one of those discussion meetings or decision meetings. So sometimes that can cause team members to bring up things and go down roads that are a little bit too detailed for that specific audience or for the purpose of that specific call. So as the meeting leader, it would be your responsibility to make sure that you are acting as that facilitator and leading the group back to focus and making sure that you're will call out, you know what, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. You know, for the purpose of today's call and getting through our agenda, we are gonna we'll schedule a breakout meeting to discuss and talk about this offline, right? That comes up a lot in meetings that we're a part of. Inviting feedback. So this, as I mentioned, we want to leave time at the end of the meeting for feedback, right? And any additional agenda items, but also inviting feedback even at the end of every specific topic. So before you move on to your next topic, right? Okay, we've come to the time for what we need to talk about for this topic. We're going to move on to our next one. Before I do, is there any specific roadblocks, or high priority concerns that we really need to make sure is documented or discussed before we move on to the next item? So note taking, so there's a few different ways that we accomplish this, right? And so we just have a couple of different options here. Again, the meeting leader may be responsible for taking those notes, and in which case, depending on if you have a presentation or not, if you don't have a presentation, you can use a shared document and you can actually share that on your screen. You can use Teams meeting notes feature or Google Docs or your project management system, such as ClickUp, potentially, to take meeting notes and show those on the call for team members to actually follow along. If you're presenting or somebody else is presenting, you can also either yourself or ask for volunteers to own the responsibility of documenting the meeting and making sure that all the items necessary are logged. So ideas, decisions, action items, updates, any parking lot items, right, or moving items that we discussed to move to the next meeting. Alex, could you ask, sorry, I'm seeing a question come in. Could you ask for individuals to document meeting without formal minutes? Could you expand on that one a little bit, Alex? I don't know if you want to come off mute or if you're not in a position to do so.
Sure. I guess I'm just curious, especially for smaller teams, does it make sense to always have like a formal note taker, or could you just let people know at the beginning, hey, maybe there are no slides to share, or we're asking folks to take their own notes. There are no formal minutes. I'm just curious, like, what's the most accessible best practice?
Yeah, I mean, best practice and most successful would be having somebody take notes to share out with the group. And it doesn't always need to be formal or really long, but really, what are the highlights? What are things that we discussed as next steps, right? And decisions, and making sure that's documented, because sometimes people have different perceptions, right? Or they're understanding the information in different ways. So it can really be helpful as that facilitator to make sure that the information that you want to make sure that they're taking away and consuming is documented, right? So that either you or that other note taker that you've assigned can provide that. It's always helpful, like if you're in a training type meeting, then you might not have formal notes, right? It might be, hey, we're going to send you these resources, but it's helpful to take notes as you go along. And yeah, I mean, again, situations vary as well. I could see in really small, team member meetings with just discussions, maybe there's not the need for notes. Potentially you have like a system where you're tracking action items. So it depends on the context, but I would say in a lot of cases, we want to try to get those notes out just to make sure any messages are clear and documented. Ideas for shifting or sharing responsibility. I often have to facilitate and take notes, which is not ideal. Yep, exactly. So it's totally up to them. I would say it's the meeting leader's responsibility as the person who organizes the meeting to determine whether you're going to take those notes or if you're going to assign that role to somebody else. So depending on the culture of your organization or the group that you're a part of, you could ask for volunteers to do that. You could just assign it to somebody if it's somebody on your team. It is definitely helpful, right? If you're presenting, you're sharing your screen, it can be difficult to do both of those things. So we definitely recommend, appointing somebody or asking for volunteers to do that. So up on the screen here, we just kind of have some tools to consider for leading impactful meetings, right? So I kind of talked about a lot of these throughout this presentation. So, right, you're always going to need a meeting platform, Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google Meet. If you want to do brainstorming, you can use a virtual whiteboard. Mural is one. Miro is another. Microsoft Teams has something as well. You can use polling or voting tools. Poly has one. If you use Slack, you can do something in Slack. If you use Teams, you can use Microsoft Forms for polls. So there's a lot of different platforms you can use for that. And then again, the shared note taking. So depending on what software you use as an organization, you might use Google Docs, you might use Microsoft Documents, or you may use another platform such as a project management tool. In person, we want to make sure screen for presenting is probably the most important here, but it can be really helpful for those brainstorming to do sticky notes and have a whiteboard as well. Awesome. So wrap up. This is a really, really important part of the meeting. We want to make sure that we have enough time to kind of wrap the meeting and recap what has come of the meeting. So recap if a specific decision has been made, recap action items if possible. Sometimes for some meetings, there might be so many action items, it can be really difficult to have the time to recap every single action item. So that's where making sure, and we'll get to follow up in just a second, that you're sending those out, but at least calling out at the end, okay, we've documented action items and action owners, so we're going to send that out, or we're going to put that in our project management system, whatever that might be, but making sure that you're clearly communicating at the end kind of where we landed with the meeting. Do we need to schedule a follow-up meeting if we didn't get through everything? And then, yeah, determining any other next steps. So follow-up, sharing what we just discussed. So making sure that you're including any action items with assignees included, and also even potential, target dates for when you're hoping to meet those action items can also be really helpful. Sharing any other notes, right? So that's where those notes come in. It might not always be actions, but just any insights or awareness pieces that can be helpful for the people that were on the call to reference back to, and also for folks that maybe weren't able to make the call. That's another really good reason to continue to take notes during meetings as well. Always asking for feedback. So in your follow-up, you can ask for feedback. We include surveys oftentimes, particularly with our clients when we're running meetings for them or with them, what could we have done differently? What are your team members saying about how this meeting was effective for them? And so on. I see we have a few more questions coming in, which is perfect. Okay. If the next meeting date is unknown, I always include that in the agenda or minutes. Perfect. Also a good practice to share full digital invite example. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, making sure that you're including that Zoom link or Microsoft Teams link right within your invite. Thank you, Alex. Those are great suggestions as well.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Thanks. So I was wondering if you had more, like you mentioned, kind of a way you can get everybody back on track. I was wondering if you had any more like helpful, I don't know, phrases or tips for when like you really have a talker in a meeting, and or it's sort of a funny like hierarchical situation, like the CEO is on and you're pitching to the client and they're the one that's really going off, and you'd like to, like, it may be possible to steer things back, but it's not quite like the same as just an email meeting with your own team.
Yeah, absolutely. So personally, my strategy is I always kill people with kindness and try not to be shy, even though I say killing with kindness, not to be shy to speak up and say, hey, thank you so much for all this input. This is really, really helpful. Even like your example of like your CEO. And sorry, I'm looking away, but I'm actually looking at you, even though my camera's over here. So even if they're coming up, and I would always just bring it back to the agenda, the end goal, or like the time that you have left. Oh, this is such valuable conversation. I'm so glad that we're having this. Thank you for bringing this up. What I'd like to do is document this down and move on to our next agenda item, because in order to make sure that we meet this end result we talked about, or to make sure that we're able to get through all these items and we only have 15 minutes left, I would recommend that we schedule a separate one-off meeting, whatever your recommendation is, and kind of move through the agenda. That's typically how I handle it. And I just am like overly, thank you so much. This is really great. So it's not like you're like shutting them down or, hey, please be quiet over there, but just in a way that you're like, hey, we set out to have this agenda. We want to get to it. And honestly, they'll probably really respect that. Oh yeah, you are right. Thank you so much. We do need to get to that. And it's really important for this client that we do.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Any other questions?
Hey, Kelly, maybe you covered it. Recording. When you record meetings, do you put that out? I missed the first part of the meeting because I had something else I had to do. Did you cover, like, when you record a meeting, do you put that like in the agenda, or do you state that? Because I don't know how it applies online, but I know there's always that kind of like, it really shouldn't even be an issue, but the whole privacy thing, like some people don't want to be involved in a recorded session or something like that. Like, do you put like a warning out?
Not typically ahead of time. It depends. So typically it's just at the beginning of the call. Hey, everybody, we're going to record this call because XYZ, so that everybody knows. And by staying on the meeting, they are agreeing to be okay with being on a meeting that's recorded. I have seen in certain cases, I've been a part of large organizations where they've scheduled meetings to talk about very sensitive subjects, and they want to make sure that team members feel comfortable, coming and providing their feedback and being open and honest. So I've seen in the agenda in those cases, documenting, hey, just that we are not going to record this call. It's really important that everybody feels comfortable and, being open and honest and all that jazz. And then also restating that at the beginning. I would say I don't typically do it for every meeting. You could for like training meetings, Brian, or really large meetings, if there's the concern of there's a lot of people and some people might be out. Sometimes I might include in the meeting invite, we'll record this session for anybody who's going to miss it. So it's not as much like a warning to the people on the call that it's going to be recorded, but more so, hey, if you're not able to make it, don't worry, we'll have the resources that you need to be successful.
Yeah, I would agree. And Alex made that comment too. That's typically when I record things, it's for, training sessions or something that I know, like, part of my audience can't make it because of a conflict, but they need to at least know what went on. And I find it's easier than, I mean, sometimes you have to have the formal note taking, it's a requirement, but I find that, in a key meeting, if somebody can't make it, it's a hard out for them if you can record that so they have that information and they can really, get what they need out of that meeting by skipping ahead. But yeah, it's just something that crossed my mind when you were talking about agenda at the beginning, and I was like, yeah, making sure you put a warning statement or not even a warning statement. It's a little strong, but yeah, like, hey, we're recording this meeting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's a great call out, Brian, for sure. Absolutely, at the very minimum, at the beginning of the meeting, stating that, which I didn't mention in the welcome of the call, right? That would be under like setting those expectations if we want cameras on or that we're going to record the call and all that jazz. But I think there are certain circumstances where including it in the meeting invite can be very helpful.
Thanks. I really appreciate the advice. Awesome.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. We don't want to keep you for too much longer. Just a couple quick slides. Echo Consulting, we do offer facilitation meetings. We run strategic planning, annual planning for a lot of organizations, both clients that we currently have and outside of that. So just for your awareness, you can always schedule for a free facilitation. And then also just want to call out, we do webinars once a month, and we have one coming up in November on an introduction to change management. So we look forward to seeing you there if that is of interest to you. So thank you so much, and we will send out, again, this slide deck and a survey. So thank you for joining, and thanks for hanging on our meeting best practices meeting that went long. Appreciate everybody.
Thank you.